Hello and welcome to week 9. I am going to try to get through this in one take. I'm not sure if I can. My dog may start barking, so we have people coming in and out here at the house, so I may have to pause this. But hopefully I can get through in one take, so we'll see. I hope everyone had a terrific break and that you are recharged and ready for the remainder of the semester. It will go fast, I promise. I want you to pay close attention to your syllabus and to goals 4 and 5. And 4, I've asked one of the goals for you for the semester is to explain the impact of cultural pluralism on the development of religion in the United States. And so to define cultural pluralism, this is a term used when smaller groups within a larger society maintain their unique cultural identities and their values and practices are accepted by the wider culture, provided they are consistent with the laws and values of the wider society. So keep a close watch on cultural pluralism and its development in U.S. religion for the rest of this semester. I also want you, for goal 5, to work on refining the skills and processes of deliberation, debate, and dialogue. So this really means I want to see an increased participation by you in the discussion forum. So go back and read posts from your fellow students, ask questions, share insights, things that you think might help them clarify some questions they have, or help prompt some questions that you have. So I will be posting on these forums as well in order to keep the conversation going. So those 2 goals, 4 and 5, we'll be focusing on for this part of the semester. So this week we will look at religion in America at the turn of the 20th century. And you'll read chapters 11 in your textbook here, Cities and Gospels, and chapter 12, The Church in the World. So go ahead and read that for this week. This is a time period of tremendous change for churches and religious Americans, as well as for society as a whole. And you might remember from a survey class of this time period that you've taken, this was an era that was marked by imperialism and empire, as well as progressive reforms. So it was in the late 19th century that the age of imperialism really took hold, and this was a time when the United States and other major world powers rapidly expanded their territorial possessions. But even before the United States took colonial possessions, missionaries had already been there. So in particular, think about the Middle East, where the United States had no diplomatic or political interests at the time. American missionaries were well established by the start of the 20th century, and they helped to establish schools, medical care, and other social welfare programs in the areas. Remember also that American imperialism is partly based on American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is different from other countries because of its specific world mission to spread liberty and democracy. And so this ideology easily translated into a religious missionary impulse as well. The word empire might conjure images of ancient Rome, the Persian Empire, or the British Empire, powers that depended on military conquest, colonization, occupation, or direct resource exploitation, but empires can take many forms and imperial processes can occur in many different contexts. So a question for you to think of as we go through the materials for this week is 100 years after the United States won its independence from the British Empire, had it become an empire of its own? And if so, how would religious organizations deal with it? How would it shape individual beliefs? The question of American imperialism in general seeks to understand American interventions in such places as Cuba, the Philippines, Hawaii, Guam, and Puerto Rico, but also the deeper history of American engagement in the wider world and the ways in which American economic, political, and cultural power, and this includes religion, have shaped the actions, choices, and possibilities of other groups and nations. At the same time that the United States asserted itself abroad, it acquired increasingly higher numbers of foreign peoples at home as European and Asian immigrants arrived in the United States. In a sense, imperialism and immigration raised similar questions about American identity. Who was an American and who wasn't? What were the nation's obligations to foreign powers and foreign peoples? And how accessible and how fluid should American identity be for newcomers? All such questions confronted late 19th century Americans with unprecedented urgency. It also shaped the ways in which Americans practiced religion and the types of religion that they practiced. How would their faith intersect with the changes they were experiencing? Debates over American imperialism included notions of humanitarianism, morality, religion, and ideas of civilization. One of the biggest challenges was the changes that increased immigration had brought to American society. And so we could look at the assault against Catholicism as an example of the challenges immigrant groups faced in the United States. By the 1900s, Catholicism in the United States had grown dramatically in size and diversity, from 1% of the population a century earlier to the largest denomination in America, though still outnumbered by Protestants as a whole. As a result, Catholics in America face two intertwined challenges, one external, related to Protestant anti-Catholicism, and the other internal, having to do with the challenges of assimilation. So externally, the church and its members remained quote unquote outsider religion in a nation that continued to see itself as culturally and religiously Protestant. And many Protestants doubted whether Catholics could ever make loyal Americans because they supposedly owed primary allegiance to the Pope. So Catholic clergy approached this situation from a variety of perspectives. Some bishops advocated rapid assimilation into the English-speaking mainstream, and these so-called Americanists advocated an end to ethnic parishes, the unofficial practice of permitting separate congregations for different ethnic groups, in a belief that such isolation only delayed entry into the American mainstream. They anticipated that the Catholic Church could thrive in a nation that espoused religious freedom only if they assimilated. And meanwhile, more conservative clergy cautioned against assimilation. While they conceded that the United States had no official religion, they felt that Protestant notions of the separation of church and state and of individual liberty posed a threat to the Catholic faith. So remember from your past primary resources that eventually Pope Leo XIII weighed in on the controversy. In 1899, he sent an encyclical reminding the Americanists that the Catholic Church was a unified global body and that American liberties did not give Catholics the freedom to alter church teachings. And this tension between Catholics and American way of life would continue well into the 20th century. And so widespread dissatisfaction with new trends in American society spurred the progressive era. And I'm sure you've also learned about this era in some of your survey courses from the past. Americans had many different ideas about how the country's development should be managed and whose interests required the greatest protection. Reformers sought to clean up politics, Black Americans continued their struggle for civil rights, women demanded the vote with greater intensity, while also demanding a more equal role in society at large. And workers demanded higher wages, safer workplaces, and the union recognition that would guarantee these rights. So whatever their goals, reform became the word of the age. Many Americans were urged to action by preachers and theologians. Confronted by both the benefits and ills of industrialization, many Americans asked themselves, what would Jesus do? In fact, in 1896, Charles Sheldon, a congregational minister from Kansas, published a book, In His Steps, What Would Jesus Do?, which I have included in your materials for this week. This novel tells the story of Henry Maxwell, a pastor in a small Midwestern town who was confronted by an unemployed migrant who criticized the congregation's lack of concern for the poor and the downtrodden. Moved by the man's plight, Maxwell preached a series of sermons in which he asked his congregation Would it not be true that if every Christian in America did as Jesus would do, society itself would be so changed that human suffering would be reduced to a minimum? This book became a bestseller not only because of its story, but because its plot connected with a new movement that was transforming American religion. And this new movement was called the social gospel. The social gospel emerged within Protestant Christianity at the end of the 19th century. It emphasized the need for Christians to be concerned for the salvation of society and not just simply individual souls. So instead of just caring for family or fellow church members, social gospel advocates encourage Christians to engage society, to challenge social, political, and economic structures, and help those less fortunate than themselves. Responding to the developments of the Industrial Revolution in America and the increasing concentration of people in urban spaces with all of its social and economic problems, some social gospelers went so far as to advocate a form of Christian socialism, but all urged Americans to confront the sins of their society. Probably one of the most notable advocates of the social gospel was Walter Rauschenbusch. Rauschenbusch was a pastor at a German Baptist church in the Hell's Kitchen section of New York City. And here he confronted rampant crime and stark poverty, problems not adequately addressed by the political leaders of the city. Rauschenbusch realized that a new theological framework had to reflect his interest in society and its problems. He used the phrase, the kingdom of God, claiming that it encompassed every aspect of life and made every part of society a concern of every Christian. So, like Sheldon's Reverend Maxwell, Rauschenbusch believed that every Christian, whether they were a business person, a politician, or a stay-at-home parent, should ask themselves what they could do to enact the kingdom of God on earth. But we can't forget that glaring blind spots persisted within the proposals of most social gospel advocates. As men, they often ignored the plight of women, and many refused to support women's suffrage. Many were also silent on the plight of African Americans, Native Americans, and other oppressed minority groups. However, the writings of Rauschenbusch and other social gospel proponents had a profound influence on 20th century American life. Most immediately, they fueled the progressive reform, and they also inspired future activists, including Martin Luther King Jr., who envisioned a beloved community that resembled the kingdom of God. And we will look more at MLK and other Black activists in later weeks. And so while the social gospel was short-lived historically, it had a lasting impact on the policies of most of the mainline denominations in the United States. Most began programs for social reform, which led to ecumenical cooperation in 1910 during the formation of the Federal Council of Churches. Although cooperation regarding social issues often led to charges of socialism. It is likely that the social gospel's strong sense of leadership by the people also led to women's suffrage, and the emphasis it placed on morality led to prohibition. Biographer Randall Woods argues that social gospel themes learned from childhood allowed Lyndon Baines Johnson to transform social problems into moral problems. And this helps explain his longtime commitment to social justice, as exemplified by the Great Society and his commitment to racial equality. The social gospel explicitly inspired his foreign policy approach of a sort of Christian internationalism and nation building. So again, while the social gospel was short-lived historically, it had roots, and it had lasting roots. So for your week's assignments, please start by watching a lecture by U.S. religious historian Dr. Jonathan Ebel from the University of Illinois. This lecture comes from his book, Faith in the Fight, Religion and the American Soldier in the Great War. And it brings attention to the role that technology played at this time and the impact that it had on faith in America. And I know it's a long video, but it's definitely worth watching. You can listen while you do other things, or even perhaps listen on your phone for your drive. So just please do listen to it. Just as social ills had prompted social gospelers to ask, what would Jesus do? War and technology also opened up space to think about the role of faith in technology and how to justify the use of highly developed weaponry. For your primary sources, you'll start by reading Senator Albert Beveridge's March of the Flag. Please carefully look at his use of religious language to argue in support of American imperialism. And as America became involved in territories and markets abroad, it created certain barriers as well as opportunities for American missionary work. For instance, in 1899, Secretary of State John Hay articulated the open door policy, which called for all Western powers to have equal access to Chinese markets. Hay feared that other imperial powers, such as Japan, Great Britain, Germany, France, Italy, and Russia, planned to carve China into spheres of influence. It was in the economic interest of American business to maintain China for free trade. Within China, however, there arose a movement opposed to foreign businesses and missionaries, which were already operating in China, and this was called the Boxer Rebellion. And so President McKinley, in order to protect those business interests as well as the missionaries that were already there in China, sent the U.S. Army without consulting Congress, thus setting a precedent for U.S. presidents to order American troops to action around the world under their executive power. But also this kind of set the precedent as well for protecting our missionaries and those who would embark on American missionary work in foreign nations for the future. So you'll look at a few missionary organizations this week. The American Missionary Association, AMA. It was a Christian educational organization founded in 1846 in New York, and the main purpose of this organization was to abolish slavery, educate African Americans, advocate for racial equality, and promote Christian values. Its members and leaders were both black and white and chiefly affiliated with Congregationalist, Methodist, and Presbyterian churches. The organization was born amid the protests of Christian abolitionists critical of the refusal of American churches and benevolent societies to adopt and act on abolitionist principles. The AMA's founders maintained that slaveholding was a personal sin no matter what the reasons or motives underlying it, and that all blacks were members of the equal brotherhood in the family of Christ. And so you'll take a look at some of the documents from the AMA. It worked in missions in numerous nations overseas, but predominantly in China and East Asia. Perhaps the most famous mission institution at the time was the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions, the ABCFM. It was the first American Foreign Missionary Society established in 1810 by New England Congregationalists. Missionaries were sent to numerous countries and to American possessions, but their work in Hawaii was especially notable. From 1820 to 1848, more than 80 missionaries worked in Hawaii and introduced Christianity, Western education, and press. So please take a look at the primary documents I have provided. I've also included W.E. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. It's important to read. I would urge you to read all of it if you can, but please read the first chapter of this book, the chapter entitled Of Our Spiritual Strivings, which is most pertinent to this course, I believe. And also included in the introduction is one of Du Bois's most famous lines, that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So please keep that idea kind of at the front of your mind as we move through our research into the 20th century. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Please also read Reverend Norm Erlandson's On Washington Gladden and the 19th Century Labor Question, A Social Gospel Response. He discusses both Gladden and Rauschenbusch and the social gospel, and I think it's a very interesting piece of writing. You will also read James Cardinal Gibbons, The Faith of Our Fathers. I have asked you to read Chapter 2, The Unity of the Church. Gibbons was the Archbishop of Baltimore from 1877 to 1921. And so there goes my dog. So I'm going to pause this for a moment and I'll be back. So back to James Cardinal Gibbons. He served as a bridge between Roman Catholicism and American Catholic values, and he was an ardent proponent of American civic institutions and called the U.S. Constitution the finest instrument of government ever created. So in his dealings with the Vatican, he and other Americanizers championed the separation of church and state. So since this is also the era of prohibition, I have also included a link to the 18th Amendment, so that will help refresh your memory. You'll read about Frances Willard, who helped to found the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, in 1874, and served as its president from 1879 until her death. Willard was a Methodist who embraced radical reform, and she saw personal purity as the prerequisite to the cultural and spiritual sanctification that would mark the, quote, new heavens and new earth, unquote. So as president of the WCTU, she adopted the motto of do everything, to summarize its mission. In addition to promoting individual abstinence from alcohol and prohibition laws, the organization embraced a wide-ranging policy agenda including dress reform, married women's property laws, labor issue, and suffrage. Most of you have probably heard of Jane Addams and her contributions to reform. Instead of Addams, we will look at Ellen Gates Starr, who also helped to establish Hull House along with Addams. And as well as teaching at Hull House, Starr was active in the campaign to reform child labor laws and industrial working conditions in Chicago. Starr was a member of the Women's Trade Union League, and she helped organize striking garment workers in 1896, 1910, and 1915. You will read her essay, The Church Social Union. And although she was a member of the American Episcopal Church, she really aimed her message for the Christian community in its broadest sense. So go ahead and read her essay. The eugenics movement shows a darker side of the progressive era. The practice of eugenics was the idea that with scientific management, a quote-unquote better citizen could be cultivated. The idea had begun in the UK with a focus on fostering positive traits in human population, but in the United States, this turned to a focus on eliminating negative traits, thought to be genetic in nature, such as low intelligence, a propensity for crime, promiscuity, and other low morals. So these quote-unquote undesirable traits were often concentrated in poor, uneducated, and minority populations. And in an attempt to prevent these groups from propagating, eugenicists helped drive legislation for their forced sterilization. The first state to enact a sterilization law was Indiana in 1907, quickly followed by California and 20 other states by 1931. These laws resulted in the forced sterilization of over 64,000 people in the United States. And at first, sterilization efforts focused on the disabled, but later grew to include people whose crime was poverty. These sterilization programs found legal support in the Supreme Court. In the Buck versus Bell case, the state of Virginia sought to sterilize Carrie Buck for promiscuity, as evidenced by her giving birth to a baby out of wedlock. In ruling against Buck, Supreme Court Justice Wendell Holmes wrote his opinion, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles is enough." Writing in the journal Religious Education, psychologist G. Stanley Hall argued that eugenics was simply a legitimate new interpretation of our Christianity. And I have included this article that G. Stanley Hall wrote in your materials this week for you to read. Another dark episode of this era was the rise of the Second KKK. The Klan used rising immigration rates and the social situation of a changing America to play on society's fears and anxieties. At its height, its membership was between 3 and 4 million. And historian Linda Gordon has written a great book examining this movement, and I do have a copy of the book that I've just recently read. It's an interesting read, and so I'll put a link in the notes here on Blackboard for you, so you can find it on in the Glickman Library if you're interested in reading it. She argues that the Klan also served as a kind of religious organization. Klan ministers, known as Cluds, conducted ceremonies such as weddings, baptisms, funerals, and other ceremonies. And she writes that the Klan's religious rites might suggest that it functioned as a Protestant denomination. Its scripts resembled Bible readings and prayer, and its meetings resembled church services. But she continues, the Klan was not a denomination. It rather sought to incorporate existing Protestant churches in what she calls a pan-Protestant evangelical movement. So very interesting read. The group's rule book, I've put a link in your materials for you to read. Their sacred book known as the Quran. Notice how similar it is to the Quran, which was intentional on their part. It was first published 100 years ago in 1916. The Quran lays out a series of beliefs, titles, and rituals that form the core of Klan practices, sometimes dubbed Klan craft. And like I said, I have provided a link for you to look at that. So please think about the questions that I am asking here in the summary, and respond with your own questions in the discussion post. Remember, we're trying to work on deliberation, debate, and dialogue, trying to get some ideas going, challenge some of our old ideas, think about things in a different way. At the end of chapter 12, we're directed to think about the inner turmoil and dissension within American churches, and the idea that the vitality of the period expressed itself not only in service to humanity, but also in schism and division. And so the chapter ends with a question: how healthy, how whole were the nation's households of faith? So I want you to think about that. How unified were the churches? In what way did religion mirror and respond to what was happening in society? And in what ways did it stay aloof? How has the shape of religion in America changed from its early roots that we've looked at up until this point? Can you see a shift taking place? Please compose a discussion post articulating what you think about the materials we've looked at. What is the story that you're seeing? I want to know what you think. So as always, if you have any questions, please send me an email, and I will be seeing you in the discussion posts. Have a great week.